How you doing, Professor Seitzma, I believe is how you pronounce it. Jason Rees here. This is my presentation, and I may be a little unorthodox, but I'm going to start it out with a video, courtesy of the BBC. And what it does is it spotlights Elliot Rogers, who I framed my paper on, and it includes the victims' parents. It's pretty moving. It talks about the things that I discussed in my paper. Obviously, this presentation just hits the wave tops, but I thought it was interesting, and I'm going to try to keep my presentation short. So I figured I could squeeze this one in. So I'm going to play him. I'm going to hide myself so you don't have to look at me for 3 minutes, and then we'll jump right into the PowerPoint. So let's see if I got this right.
This is my last video. It all has to come to this.
News in Santa Barbara County, a gunman went on a mass shooting.
One occupant, a male wearing a white shirt, was firing as he drove by.
These young men often feel like they are owed sex.
A group name that you've probably never heard of before, incels or involuntary celibate.
Girls are not sexually attracted to me. There's a major problem with that. A major problem.
He attempted to get into one of the sorority houses with a tremendous amount of ammunition. Instead, out of frustration, he got in his car, drove around the corner, and saw my daughter. She was walking with two of her friends, and he opened fire. If this guy had gotten into that sorority house, the damage he would have done. I mean, he would have cleaned it out. He had enough weapons and enough guns to clean out every one of them, and they would have been defenseless. We like to believe that wrong place, wrong time scenario helped save 50, 60 girls' lives. So, kind of a silver lining. And, when you're in our position, you look for these, wherever you can.
We lost our only daughter. She had so much to give for this life. And she was killed at 22.
Elliot Roger really flips the switch from a community that is angry online, operating within the digital space, to a community that has the potential to carry out real acts of violence.
R.I.P. Elliot Roger, 1991, 2014.
If you want to stop this from happening to other parents and other innocent children, you need to get to the individual. You need to find a way to reach them and help them and realize that suicide isn't the way out. Going out with a bag so you can make the news isn't the way out.
The police should be looking at this in the same way they look at religious extremism online. And then at a more local level, we don't have enough discussion around mental health implications of our technological culture.
The reality of our situation is painfully simple. Our daughter died because some individual couldn't cope. This individual had felt there were avenues for help, had felt that there were people who were willing to help him understand rejection, failure, frustration, and help him through it, then my daughter might still be here. This guy who killed my daughter is gone. He doesn't feel a damn thing, right? We feel it every day. That's our reality now.
Okay, so that covered a lot of the points you'll read in my paper. and it highlighted some of the common themes you'll find, not with all incels, because they're not all radicalized or extreme, but what we'll find out in some of the literature review and then the discussion results that it's growing. Right wing extremism is growing in general, but the incel movement is gaining traction. And what's problematic is that we have a problem even defining what extremism is, what domestic terrorism is, what hate crimes. We kind of conflate all of them, and it's dramatically impacting policy. It's impacting how we study it. It's impacting efforts driven to kind of find these individuals when they're kind of going off the end, and implement some real change so that we can prevent these things from happening. Just to also capture what you looking at on my screen in the upper left, you'll see what appears to be a saint holding a tablet or a book. What it basically is something that the incel community did. It speaks to the martyrdom that Elliot Rodger, and that's what they superimpose his face on a patron saint, or that could even be Jesus Christ, but how they view him as basically their posthumous cheerleader, somebody that didn't necessarily start the incel movement, but definitely catapulted it into the limelight. And then in the left center, you see incels.is. That's just one of many internet forums or websites that are built, and it's built to house incel communication. And a lot of times they're taken down because they go from rhetoric to proclaiming violence and kind of trying to exacerbate some people that just have feelings, and then they kind of push them either to suicide, which is counterintuitive because the movement is supposed to be welcoming and it's supposed to give them a sense of belonging, but a lot of it is hate, and then also to the misogyny aspect of it, where it becomes violent not only against them being violent against themselves vis-a-vis suicide, but against unwitting victims. So already 7 minutes in, let's move through this then. I think I'm on literature review, and I shouldn't be, so my PowerPoint is here. Let me back up one. Nope. Let's go two. Okay. Let me pause this. Sorry, apologies. I hit a slide I shouldn't have. So background of the paper, this will go along the lines of chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. So background, the problem, I generalize it as manosphere, rhetoric becoming increasingly violent. It doesn't necessarily just mean the incelibate community, but like I mentioned, it's just gender-driven ideology that becomes a hatred. Manosphere is more generalized, like you've heard of toxic masculinity, things of that nature. But nothing typifies, toxic as becoming radicalized and then committing acts of terror, essentially. Purpose was to identify what can be done collaboratively to address these concerns, because it's such a not new, obviously, gender-driven hate and just prejudices and things of that nature are not new. But when you have a movement afoot that kind of foments violence that wouldn't otherwise be there if it wasn't for the movement, then that becomes an issue. Rationale is to build on existing literature and articulate a way ahead. Limitations, internet ephemerality, coupled with free speech and human volition. So what I mean by that is, and like I said, incels.is could, I'm not sure if it's active right now, but there's a number of sites, they build them and then they get taken down, and then they build them a different moniker, a different domain, and then it's so quick and it changes so rapidly that it's very hard to capture what's going on at any specific time, and that becomes limitation not only of research, but also in figuring out movement and specifically individuals and what they're doing. And then coupled with free speech and human volition, only because they're allowed to go online and say, I hate women, and all the things that, if you go and if you enumerate the things that they espouse, it's legal to say those things. But human volition or free will means that you can't then take that language and either incite violence to the point where people are committing acts, either they're killing themselves or they're killing others. And then the hypothesis was, in generally, even though we use incels in the community to frame the overarching discussion, whether extremism and terrorism are distinctions without a difference, meaning a lot of times we'll see those words used interchangeably. We'll see a mass shooting that looks like it could be part of an incel movement, and then they'll mention terrorism, they'll mention extremism, they'll mention hate crime. The feds look at it differently, perhaps, than local and state. Whether or not they can rise to the level of what they would like to call it a terrorism charge, I think it's a lot of rhetoric, because we'll find out that there's really no difference between the two. Literature review, I kind of broke it down into 4 parts: terrorism and extremism. So there was a number of articles with a depth of research, because it's just all the craze these days, right? Since 9/11 and even before that. But and as you see at the end of these 1, 2, 3, and 4, 1, 2, and 3, these bullets, I have smaller font numbers and brackets, and that'll bring you to the reference that was used to cite in the paper, that is. But 4 points about in the literature that I looked at was that both are subjective and ambiguous definitions. Everybody defines it a little differently, whether it's in state statutes, the federal government, and even agencies within the government. Lack of uniformity, again, with applications of the law. So a lot of states, state district attorneys, they don't want to use the word terror because they may have something in their statutes that preclude them from taking that word and bringing charges that rise to that word. And then so you'll find in my paper that some states like Idaho come in and then they frame the wording a little differently, and they kind of become more specific what terrorism is defined as. Ideological versus non-ideological disparities. You'll hear right-wing extremism used a lot, but within that extremism, you'll have the motivators, and there's because the news and social media kind of highlight and put a spotlight on a lot of these killings that are driven by ideology, we tend to think that these ideological crimes are committed at a much greater rate and volume, but it tends to be not that. That's not the case. And then right-wing crimes outpace other terrorism. That kind of goes hand in hand with ideological, non-ideological. We think ideology. We think ISIS, Al Qaeda. We think the Twin Towers and such. But we'll see in a graph in my paper that, and the FBI puts out stats on threat levels, that domestic hate crimes and right-wing crimes, as they call them, are occurring and have taken more lives over the last few years than foreign terrorism. That is. Statutes and policy. Foreign terrorist organizations. Obviously, that's for foreign terrorists, not domestic. We don't have domestic terrorist organization lists. We just name activities that rise to the occasion, rise to the level of what we would consider domestic terrorism, but there's nothing explicitly defined. Collaboration as a fundamental framework, meaning bringing experts together to fight the problem instead of everybody working inside their own vacuum and then bringing forth their ideas of what a good way ahead is instead of collaborating together. Constitutional protections and privacy considerations. There's a fine line between what you can and can't censor, what you can and can't say online, and that line gets thinner and thinner with every court precedent that's set. Stare decisis takes the Constitution and, and the amendments, particularly the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and that's how you get a lot of hesitancy when it comes to acting before these people act, regarding like law enforcement, when they see some of this hate online. And to round it out, mental health crises, negative links to social media and well-being. So the plurality of studies say that the more you're on social media, typically the less mental health you have. Radicalization motivated by ideology. Search for identity and social inclusion. So a lot of these people, a lot of the people in the incel community are going to these forums to search for social inclusion, identity. It's like a social psychology type of thing, where they're looking for an echo chamber. They're looking to be reinforced, but yet it's a corrosive environment within those forums. So it kind of becomes counterintuitive for people to continue to patronize them, but they do. And then lastly, on the internet in general and social networks in particular, heavy users exhibit greater social trust. That was done by Facebook people, so who knows about that? And that was a little older study, but I think they're driving a narrative on that. Pockets of subcultures inside a corrosive echo chamber. I alluded to that earlier, but it's happening on the internet. Never before has the internet brought so many like-minded people together, and that's both positive and negative. And then that also occurs on the internet and social networks with people with hashtags, or they have their characters. Sometimes they don't show their faces, or their names are not their real names. So anonymity hurts. Gives them more power. They feel more open to express themselves, perhaps, but you can't surveil them as easily, and impacts detection. So from a law enforcement perspective. And then just the internet in general is just fast. It changes all the time. So what happened today is what's happening right now. A isn't being recorded. You can't capture metadata of everything that happens on the internet. And then it's up one day, it's down the other. And then, the next thing you know, somebody acts on their ideology. So the results, I put a seminal event being Elliot Rodger. We listened to some of his rants in his video blog before he did the murder and then killed himself. He told him in his manifesto that he was a supreme gentleman. That was his self-professed name. He killed 6. He killed himself then. The problem was that not only did he take the lives of the others, really who cares about him, but that act kind of spurred more acts. It fueled martyrdom status. That's where we get that picture in the upper left corner. And then he's referred to in a number of other violent cases that we've seen lately that have ties to the incel movement. Radicalization patterns, we saw that hate crime and terrorism are close cousins. They're not distant relatives. And that's borne out in the studies. Part of that radicalization occurs, and this kind of links to mental health, but they feel that in one study that their appearance was over 80% a factor, and poor self-confidence nearly as high in why they became radicalized. And that was when they interviewed actual incels as part of a study. And I think it's a different study, but injustice and inequality was not only a factor, but it's something that they admit was a daily motivator to radicalize them. That they felt that it wasn't just moments, but it was just the social strata, the social structure in general, with women being basically dominant over them because they hold all the cards essentially. And ideological pathology, they dehumanize women. I mean, there's no doubt about it, and to the point where it becomes a curse. Their thinking is just all skewed. However, studies indicate not all terrorists or extremists, whatever you want to call them, are deranged. Many of them are methodical. They may have mental health problems, but they're not quote unquote crazy. And that makes them altogether more dangerous. And then also in the results, lastly, is the prevalence of non-ideological active shooter events is actually lower than, or is higher rather than ideological active shooter events. However, they kind of travel at the same pace over time, except the ideologically driven individuals do it less often, though it receives more media coverage, so we feel like it's more robust. And lastly, the web. And I indicated, and I talked a little bit about this subreddit r incel tears, and it's a parody of the incel movement. So it's a bunch of mostly guys getting on there and basically making fun of incels, which obviously doesn't help, and that's why society is a problem. But they say that they're also not moderators, so to speak, but they're kind of like overseeing their activity. But if you visit the website, or if you just do some cursory research, they're basically just dogging them. And then active forms legitimize violence. And we talked about that. When you get all people thinking the same way on the same space, then that reinforcement just drives further indignation, and they think that they're righteous in how they feel. And then also counter to that is using the web and online data to inform research, and because you gotta identify patterns, and you gotta find in order to look at solutions. So part of the discussion was the continuum of the life of Elliot Rodgers from when he was a young child until he committed the murders. Not going to go over that here, but it's in the paper, and that kind of frames the whole paper and what misogyny, personified, is about. Lack of synergy among stakeholders persists, so people are still not getting together. The sociologists, the psychologists, the clinicians, law enforcement, even computer engineers and scientists to develop software to kind of be able to pick out in a somewhat non-invasive way patterns so that they can kind of shape a narrative that counters the incel movement and kind of breathe fresh air into these young minds. Ethical considerations, again, privacy may be subjugated to action, so this is a point where privacy and security, that fine line can be crossed moderately, not a lot, but a little bit, to glean information to prevent murder. But that's an ongoing debate on when can you step in and take somebody into custody, when can you admit him involuntarily to for a mental health assessment. So a lot of further research on that, but there's got to be something done so that they can bridge, that they can take their anonymity that they have online and then kind of reduce it a little bit so that we can somehow capture these individuals. But it all starts with, if you see something, say something. I know that's played out, but it truly is. And I talked about that in the paper, that it's got to be grassroots efforts as well. And then gender bias, as far as ethical, could obfuscate results. So I think I mentioned it in a discussion, and I'll mention it again here. One of the studies, 10, whatever that correlates to down in the references, I think it was 4 or 5 women that did the study, and there's nothing wrong with that. But they kind of, you can read into, when you're reading their literature, and it's qualitative, and they do qualitative and quantitative analysis, but when you're looking at the way they arrived at some of the numbers and how they frame stuff, you can tell, if you didn't read who the authors were, you'd probably get the impression that females wrote this article. So that's just something to be known, that it's unavoidable, but you have to at least put that out there and get it from both sides, so that we're not just looking at misogyny and then everything looks, the whole saying, if all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. But we need to be cool-headed when we go into doing some of these extensive research projects. And then recommendations, and I put it basically as a call to action. So again, collaborate with experts in the wide range of disciplines, as I noted earlier. Grassroots efforts vis-a-vis societal pressure to mount strategic prevention offensive. Oh, it's hard to say. I don't know why I wrote it like that. But what I mean by that is, you can't play defense, because if you do that, it's too late. The act has already been committed, particularly if it ends in suicide. Then you can't really interview them, interrogate them, assess them, find out what motivated them, even though forensically you can kind of figure it out. It's better to have a warm body to see, and then also to interview acquaintances and people that they went to school with, or if they were seeing a mental health professional, why help wasn't offered or what could have been done better, so that they didn't have to go to those extreme measures. But it's going to start in the home. It's going to start with family and friends, and those are the first people that are going to kind of understand and see the shift in just somebody that's a little introverted, and then as they go through that continuum of radicalization, that something is a little amiss. And then lastly, standardization of definitions in domestic policy. So I don't have the background to make a recommendation on if policy should change in earnest at a federal level, but I think we need to just come to an understanding that it's an ongoing issue, and if the DOJ at the federal level pushes down some sort of best practices that the states can adopt, and we get all on the same page, then I think that would pay dividends into fighting this scourge on society, which is really what it is. And here are the references. If you need to look at them, you'll obviously have this. You can pause and kind of see where I got it from in my paper. It aligns with that as well. And that rounds it out. So I went well over my time. Hopefully I'm not deducted points, but I appreciate the opportunity to present this, and I'm sorry I'm rambling, but I'm trying to figure out how to hide that. That doesn't want to do that. There we go. So I enjoyed the class. I hope you enjoy my paper, and maybe we'll meet sometime down south. Well, for me down south, I'm in Wildemar. But have a good day. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to present this to you.